All right, settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey. Forget what you think you know about old music or complicated rock. We're not here for a dry history lesson, nor are we going to tiptoe around the edges of what makes this stuff truly special. We're diving headfirst into the glorious, often baffling, and utterly essential world of Yes, specifically their golden era from 69 to 78. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll not only understand why these guys mattered, but you might just find yourself humming a 10-minute epic in the shower. Now, I've spent decades sifting through dusty vinyl, poring over liner notes, interviewing roadies and rock stars, and generally living and breathing this stuff. So when I talk about Yes, I'm not just regurgitating Wikipedia entries. This isn't some sanitized AI-generated summary. This is the real deal, the grit and the glory, the kind of insight you get from years of immersion, not just a quick search. We're going to talk about the music, sure, but we're also going to talk about the vibe, the zeitgeist, the technology, the personalities, and the sheer audacity of what these five blokes from London pulled off. Let's get one thing straight. Yes wasn't just a band. They were an event. They were a statement. In an era when rock music was still finding its feet, still figuring out if it wanted to be three-chord rebellion or something more, Yes decided to build cathedrals. They decided that a rock song didn't have to be 3 minutes and a catchy chorus. It could be 20 minutes with multiple movements, time signature changes that would make a jazz professor sweat, and lyrics that sounded like they were pulled from ancient scrolls or a particularly vivid dream. Think about it. The late 60s were a wild time. The Beatles had just blown everyone's minds with Sgt. Pepper. Hendrix was redefining what a guitar could do, and the counterculture was in full swing. There was this palpable sense that anything was possible, that the old rules were crumbling. And into that fertile chaos stepped John Anderson and Chris Squire, two blokes with a shared vision, to make music that was more intricate, more ambitious, more beautiful. They weren't content to just play the blues or churn out pop hits. They wanted to fuse the raw energy of rock with the compositional sophistication of Stravinsky, the harmonic richness of the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, and the improvisational spirit of modern jazz. A tall order, right? But they pulled it off. It all began in the summer of 1968, in an unlikely but perfectly fitting place for the era, the La Chasse Club in Soho, London. Chris Squire, a bassist with a sound as imposing as his stature, was finishing a set with his psychedelic band Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. His style was already a sonic anomaly. He didn't see the bass as a mere rhythmic foundation. He saw it as a second baritone guitar, a melodic voice that could duel with the lead guitar. Using a 1964 Rickenbacker 4001S, which he modified for stereo output, and played with a Herco pick, he produced a trebly percussive tone full of overtones that cut through the mix in a way few bassists did. He was the engine and the melody simultaneously. John Anderson, meanwhile, was a vocalist from Accrington with a voice that seemed to come from another plane, an almost angelic countertenor, but with a will of steel. He was at the club that night, serving drinks, disillusioned with his career so far, but with a head full of ideas about vocal harmonies and expansive musical structures. A mutual acquaintance introduced them, and the ensuing conversation was not just about music, but about a shared philosophy. They discovered a mutual love for the vocal harmonies of the Fifth Dimension, and Simon and Garfunkel, and the orchestral arrangements of the Beatles. They didn't just want to play rock, they wanted to orchestrate it with the instruments of a rock band. That initial conversation was the seed of everything. They weren't just two musicians meeting, they were two architects discovering they had the same blueprint for a sonic cathedral that did not yet exist. The vision was clear. Create music that was structurally complex, harmonically rich, and lyrically positive and spiritual. Their vision needed more than just bass and vocals. They required musicians who could not only play but think outside the box. The first to join was drummer Bill Bruford. Young, but already a musician of incredible sophistication, Bruford came from a jazz background. He didn't simply play the beat, he danced around it with surgical precision. A masterful use of the snare, his sharp cracking sound was his signature, and a sense of dynamics that was rare in the rock of the time. He was the intellectual engine the band needed, always pushing the rhythmic boundaries. Next came guitarist Peter Banks. Banks was an energetic and inventive musician, deeply immersed in the London psychedelic scene. His guitar was sharp, exploratory, and full of ideas, mixing rock with jazz influences. Finally, keyboardist Tony Kaye completed the original lineup. Kaye was a specialist on the Hammond B3 organ. Unlike the more flamboyant keyboardists of the era, Kaye was a textural player. His sound, rooted in rock and R&B, provided a solid, rich foundation upon which the others could build their complexities. He was the sonic glue of the early band. Together they were Yes. The name, suggested by Banks, was intentionally positive, short, and graphic. It was a statement of intent in a world leaning towards darker, heavier names. Their self-titled debut album, released in 1969, was more than just a collection of songs. It was a manifesto. The opening track, Beyond and Before, was a reworking of a Mabel Greer's Toy Shop song, but now infused with the energy and complexity of the new band. The album also showcased their unique ability to take other artists' songs and transform them into something entirely their own. The Beatles' Every Little Thing was transformed from a 2-minute pop song into a nearly 6-minute psychedelic epic with a dark introduction and a long improvisational section. The Byrds' I See You was extended with long passages of jazz improvisation, showcasing the almost telepathic interplay between Bruford and Banks. But it was the original compositions that truly pointed to the future. Harold Land was a complex piece inspired by the jazz saxophonist of the same name, while the mystical Survival showcased Anderson's lyrical ambitions and the vocal harmonies that would become the band's trademark. It was a promising start, a glimpse of what was to come. The album wasn't a huge commercial success, but it earned the band a residency at London's famous Marquee Club, and a reputation as one of the most exciting live acts on the scene. With their second album, Time and a Word, the band's ambition grew exponentially. Anderson and Squire, in particular, wanted to expand their sonic palette. The decision was made. They would add a full orchestra. For them, it was the logical next step in their quest for a symphonic sound. However, this decision created the first major fracture in the band. Peter Banks felt the orchestra was encroaching on the guitar's space, making his role redundant. He saw Yes as a 5-piece rock band, and the addition of strings and brass was, in his opinion, a step in the wrong direction. Tension mounted during the recordings. The result is a fascinating but transitional album. Songs like No Opportunity Necessary, No Experience Needed, a reworking of a film theme with the riff from The Big Country, sound grand and imposing with the orchestra. The title track and Sweet Dreams are beautiful symphonic pop pieces, but at the same time the raw energy of the rock band sometimes seemed at odds with the string arrangements. The controversy culminated in Banks's departure before the album was even released. Ironically, the album cover had already been printed, and Banks appears on it despite having been replaced by Steve Howe. It was a bitter end for the band's first incarnation, but a change that would prove to be the most crucial in their history. The void left by Banks's departure was immense, but the arrival of Steve Howe not only filled it, but completely redefined the sound of Yes. Howe was not just a rock guitarist. He was a virtuoso with an encyclopedic knowledge of styles. He could play rock with the ferocity of anyone, but he was also a master of classical guitar, flamenco, country, influenced by Chet Atkins, and jazz. He was a composer in his own right. When Howe joined the band, he brought with him a collection of guitars. His Gibson ES-175 would become iconic, and a mind full of musical ideas that fit perfectly with Anderson and Squire's vision. He didn't just play solos. He composed with the guitar, creating textures, harmonies, and counterpoints that elevated the songs to a new level. He was the missing piece, the catalyst that would allow the band's ambition to become reality. If the first two albums were the promise, the Yes album was the fulfillment. Released in 1971, it was the first album to feature Steve Howe, and his influence is felt in every note. For the first time, the band was free from external arrangements and could create their own symphonic sound, with Howe and Kaye functioning as a guitar and keyboard orchestra. The album also marked the rise of sound engineer Eddie Offord, whose crystal-clear production work would become essential to the band's sound, to the point of being considered the sixth member. Yours Is No Disgrace, opens the album like a musical declaration of war. At nearly 10 minutes long, it's a roller coaster of contrasting sections, powerful riffs, and guitar and keyboard solos that feel like musical conversations. Starship Trooper is a three-part suite that became a band anthem, culminating in the Worm section, a hypnotic, crescendoing riff built on a relentless rhythmic bass, which would become a platform for extended improvisation in their live shows. And amidst all this complexity, How Gifted the World Clap, a solo acoustic ragtime piece recorded live, which became a staple of his repertoire and showcased his virtuosity in a completely different way. The album's success gave the band the confidence and resources to dream even bigger. Following the success of the Yes album, Tony Kaye left the band. While his Hammond organ was effective, he was resistant to using the new electronic keyboards that were emerging, such as the Moog synthesizer and the Mellotron, a keyboard that played tapes of orchestral sounds. The band, however, desperately wanted to explore these new technologies. The search for a new keyboardist led them to Rick Wakeman. Wakeman was a classically trained prodigy from the Royal College of Music. He was already a legend in London studio circles, having played on iconic songs like David Bowie's Space Oddity and Cat Stevens's Morning Has Broken. When he joined Yes, he brought with him not only impeccable technique, but an arsenal of keyboards, multiple mini-Moogs, Mellotrons, organs, pianos, and a flair for showmanship. With his sequined cape and his bank of keyboards that looked like the cockpit of a spaceship, Wakeman was the final piece of the puzzle. He was the Liszt to the band's Stravinsky. With Wakeman on board, the band returned to the studio and, in a burst of creativity, recorded Fragile. To speed up the process and deal with financial pressures, they adopted a unique approach. The album would contain 4 full band pieces and 5 solo vignettes, each highlighting a band member. It was a brilliant move that not only saved time, but also introduced the world to the individual musical personalities that made up the whole. The result was a tour de force. The band pieces were among the strongest they had ever written. Roundabout, with its reverse tape harmonic guitar intro and pulsating bass riff, became an unlikely hit on American radio, despite its rhythmic and structural complexity. South Side of the Sky was a dramatic and powerful piece, with a central piano solo from Wakeman that sounded like a sonic blizzard. But it was Heart of the Sunrise that encapsulated what Yes had become, a piece of over 10 minutes of controlled fury, delicate beauty, and breathtaking complexity, culminating in a reprise of the theme from Anderson's We Have Heaven. The solo pieces, from Wakeman's Cans and Brahms to Squire's The Fish Schindleria Prematurus, each section of the song using a different time signature, with 7/8 being the main one, were fascinating windows into the minds of their creators. If the Yes album was the masterpiece and Fragile was the hit, Close to the Edge was the ascension. This is not just an album, it is a landmark in music history. With only 3 tracks, the album was the band's most ambitious and cohesive artistic statement to date, a work that transcended rock to become a piece of modern symphonic music. The title track, occupying the entire first side of the vinyl, is an 18-minute symphony in 4 movements, loosely inspired by Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha. It begins with sounds of nature, then explodes into the solid time of change, a calculated instrumental chaos that defies conventions of rhythm and melody. This then dissolves into Total Mass Retain, where Anderson's main vocal melody emerges. The centerpiece, I Get Up, I Get Down, is a section of almost religious calm, with vocal harmonies from Anderson, Squire, and Howe that sound like a church choir layered over a church organ solo by Wakeman. The calm is broken by the final explosion of Seasons of Man, which recapitulates the previous musical themes in an overwhelming climax before fading back into the sounds of nature. The second side contains 2 other masterpieces. And You and I is a predominantly acoustic piece that unfolds like a flower in 4 parts, a pastoral ode to spirituality and human connection. Siberian Khatru is the closest thing to a rock track on the album, yet it's still filled with rhythmic complexity and time signature changes, featuring one of Howe's most memorable riffs. However, the creation of this masterpiece came at a cost. The recording sessions were intense and exhausting, with the band assembling and disassembling the songs note by note. For Bill Bruford, a musician who thrived on jazz spontaneity, the process became artistically stifling. As soon as the album was completed, he shocked the music world by leaving Yes at the height of their success to join King Crimson. The band had to quickly find a replacement for the imminent tour, recruiting former Plastic Ono Band drummer Alan White, who had only 3 days to learn one of the most complex repertoires in rock history, a Herculean task he successfully accomplished. After the stratospheric success of Close to the Edge, the question was, what next? For Yes, the answer was simple. Go even further. The result was Tales from Topographic Oceans, a double album with only 4 songs, each occupying an entire side of vinyl. The inspiration for this monumental project came to John Anderson after reading a footnote in Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. He and Steve Howe locked themselves in a hotel room and sketched out the album's conceptual framework, basing each track on one of the 4 classes of Shastric scriptures. The recording studio was decorated to look like a farm, complete with cardboard cows and hay, in an attempt to create an organic atmosphere that contrasted with the cerebral nature of the music. The album is undoubtedly the band's most challenging work. It is a vast and often abstract soundscape, with long instrumental passages, ethereal textures, and lyrics that are more cosmic poetry than narrative. The Revealing Science of God, Dance of the Dawn, is a majestic opening piece, while The Remembering, High the Memory, is more pastoral and fluid. The Ancient, Giants Under the Sun, is the most experimental, with atonal sections and exotic percussion. Ritual Nous sommes du Soleil concludes the album with a celebratory theme and a long climactic drum and percussion battle. For fans willing to dive in, it was a deeply rewarding experience. For others, and for many critics, it was the personification of progressive rock excess, an act of artistic hubris. The recording was equally controversial. Rick Wakeman, in particular, felt the material was too rarefied and lacked musical substance. Famously, he would spend time between takes eating curry on stage and expressing his discontent. Tales divided the fan base and the band itself, but it remains a testament to Yes's unflinching refusal to compromise their artistic vision. One cannot speak of Yes from this era without mentioning their visual presentation. The collaboration with artist Roger Dean was fundamental to the band's identity. Dean's otherworldly landscapes, which adorned the album covers of Fragile, Close to the Edge, and Tales, were not just art. They were portals to the band's musical universe, with their floating islands, organic architecture, and fantastical wildlife. This aesthetic was carried onto the stage. Yes tours became legendary events. The Tales from Topographic Oceans tour, in particular, featured one of the most elaborate stage sets ever built, with fiberglass structures that looked like they had stepped out of a Dean painting, including the famous crab shell and state-of-the-art lighting. For Yes, the concert was not just about playing the music. It was about creating an immersive, multi-sensory experience that transported the audience to another world. The tensions that arose during the recording of Tales finally led to Rick Wakeman's departure in 1974. He felt the band had strayed too far from rock and wanted to pursue his own solo projects, which were already proving extremely successful. His departure left another huge void to be filled. The band auditioned several keyboardists, including the Greek musician Vangelis, before settling on Patrick Moraz. A Swiss musician, Moraz had a background in jazz and classical music, and his approach to synthesizers was more percussive and fusion-influenced than Wakeman's. His arrival would inject a new energy and a new sonic direction into the band. With Moraz on board, the band regrouped to record Relayer. The sound of this album is noticeably different from its predecessors. It is denser, more aggressive, and heavily influenced by the jazz fusion of bands like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Alan White's shift from a more straightforward drumming style to a more complex polyrhythmic one is also evident here. The Gates of Delirium, the 22-minute piece that opens the album, is perhaps the most intense and violent composition of Yes's career. Inspired by Tolstoy's War and Peace, the music is a sonic depiction of battle, with dissonant guitar riffs, chaotic rhythms, and keyboard textures that sound like clashing metal. The cacophony eventually dissolves into Soon, one of the most serene and beautiful melodies John Anderson has ever written, representing the peace after the conflict. The other 2 tracks, Sound Chaser and To Be Over, showcase the band's 2 extremes. The former is an exercise in frantic fusion and technical virtuosity, while the latter is an ethereal and beautifully constructed ballad. Relayer proved that Yes could change and evolve dramatically, absorbing new influences without losing their essence. After the Relayer tour, the band decided to do something unprecedented for a group of their stature. They took a break so that each member could record and release a solo album simultaneously under the Yes banner. It was a risky move, but one that allowed each musician to explore their own ideas. The resulting solo albums, John Anderson's Alias of Sun Hillow, a concept album he played entirely himself, Chris Squire's Fish Out of Water, considered by many a lost Yes album, Steve Howe's Beginnings, Patrick Moraz's The Story of I, and Alan White's Ramshackled, were all unique and served as a creative release valve. In 1977, amidst the explosion of punk rock, which declared war on bands like Yes and their dinosaur rock, they regrouped. Patrick Moraz had departed, and in a move that delighted fans, Rick Wakeman returned to the fold. They moved to Montreux, Switzerland to record a new album, and the result was Going for the One. This album marked a change in direction. The songs were shorter, more direct, and more energetic. The title track was a vibrant rock and roll number. Wondrous Stories became a hit single in the UK with its catchy melody, and Parallels featured a powerful church organ sound from Wakeman. It seemed like a deliberate response to the musical climate, an attempt to prove they could still rock. However, the band had not abandoned their epic ambitions. The album closes with Awaken, a 15-minute masterpiece that many fans consider one of the band's finest compositions. With its harps, choirs, complex structures, and spiritual themes, Awaken was Yes in its purest form, a synthesis of everything they had learned in the previous decade. The final album of the Golden Era, 1978's Tormato, is often seen as the most problematic. Recorded at a time when musical trends were changing drastically and the record company's pressure for hits was immense, the album reflects a band in conflict. There were disagreements over musical direction and production, the use of new keyboards like the Polymoog and the Byrotron, a version of the Mellotron that used 8-track tapes, resulted in a sound that some found thin and dated. Despite its problems, the album has its moments. On the Silent Wings of Freedom is an incredible showcase of Chris Squire and Alan White's virtuosity. Don't Kill the Whale was one of rock's first environmental anthems. However, the cohesion of the previous albums is not present. Tormato was the sound of an era coming to an end, the cracks in the cathedral beginning to show. After the tour, attempts to record new material failed, leading to the departure of John Anderson and Rick Wakeman, effectively ending the band's golden era. What made Yes so special during this remarkable decade? It wasn't just individual talent. It was the chemistry, the almost telepathic interplay between musicians who refused to accept limits. They proved that rock music could be art. It could be complex, challenging, and deeply emotional, all at the same time. Their legacy is undeniable, influencing countless bands from Rush to Dream Theater, from Iron Maiden to the Mars Volta, and even artists in seemingly distant genres who were touched by their compositional audacity and their quest for sonic beauty. They weren't just writing songs, they were building worlds, and those worlds captured on vinyl between 1969 and 1978 remain as vast, mysterious, and inviting as ever. The sonic cathedral of Yes still stands, and its doors are always open for those willing to step inside and listen.